Supposedly, wholeheartedly, I prove myself. Vulnerability staggers my voice, it beats me, but I battle on. If countless others can, so can I. Battling on, I sustain my breath. Composure enlivens the air. And this is me. In this moment, description encrypts your thoughts. Time's constancies has handed its woes, its cast nets, its pulls, its throws, but surrounded by others, I sustain my breath, as though to me it was my world, earth, and universe. How valuable is this breath? How much we beg for more. When questioned of money, competition, success, I choose this breath. My world's entirety lives unannounced but welcome. When I awake, see through shining eyes, I asleep, see through the dark. When illness strikes, camouflaged in us, its telltale signs written over our health, I count my blessings, all 101, unmask myself and feel strength in pain, my ancient wreckage born again, this time wonderless, this time known, this time told about, this time shown. Illness an illusion that we are strong, but really that our lives aren't long, finite, beyond control, counterclockwise to appreciation, akin to all our celebration. My mind has wandered from head to toe about dearest matters of truth untold, but what gives power more to power pose is showing how your garden grows. When faced with floods or quakes or hails, when wind rattles our rusted nails, it's tiring work to stand undefeated, brave-boned and certain to self. When gravity bellows weight at our hearts, it shows us how to breathe. I tell myself, I must. If others can, so can I. Battling on, I sustain my breath. Composure enlivens the air. And this is me. Thank you. Thank you. I've been writing poetry for just about a decade. In this time, I've written sonnet after sonnet, poem after poem of poetry that never included any sense of myself in it. I want to tell you how I found the I in my poetry and why it matters. I've written here a quote that says, "Poetry requires the belief that your writing is action enough and that your place within it is real." I will come back to this quote in just a little bit, but first I need to backtrack to a story about my grandfather. This is my grandpa Jim. When he was 5 years old, he was taken from his mother as part of the stolen generation in Australia. He was placed in dormitories and he was never to see his mother again. Despite this, my grandfather became a hard-working man and, with my beautiful grandmother Anne, bought their own home and raised a large family of their own. When I was 7 years old, I went to visit my grandfather at his beach shack, and he had waiting for me a pile of seeds in a saucepan. He instructed me to plant those seeds in a line down beside his beach shack. But being just a child, I had no interest at all in planting those seeds. In fact, I probably didn't even know how to do it. But to this day, I've always wondered how big those trees would be now had I planted them that day. As an adult, I'm deeply passionate about the environment and wildlife conservation, so as a poet, I've dedicated myself to writing poetry about the environment and everything it encompasses. It's my attempt, if you will, to plant those seeds, but in a different way. So going back to this quote, poetry requires the belief that your writing is action enough and that your place within it is real. For writing in particular, but this goes for everything, you need to have the belief that your writing is action enough. I didn't always know this. Here is a photo of me with my professor, Richard Lansdowne. Richard was the first person I showed my poetry to. I remember the day very well. It was directly after a class on sonnets of the English Renaissance, and I mustered up the courage to show Richard my poetry. I didn't expect what would happen. He encouraged me that it was good and that I should keep writing. "Really?" I said to him. "Yes, really," Richard said. Richard could have easily told me not to quit my day job, but he didn't. It goes to show that showing that you believe in something or someone can be life-changing. But showing that you believe in yourself can not only be life-changing for you, but it allows others to believe in themselves too. I've probably shown Richard some of the worst poetry I've ever written, but he was that person for me. Even still, I really believed that I had to achieve some sort of publication or recognition from an outside source before I could tell the rest of my friends and family that I wrote poetry. Worldwide, it's extremely difficult to get your poetry published or noticed. You never know what publishers are looking for and when, and most of the time you can only submit a poem once for consideration at any given place, at any given time, so that complicates things a lot more. This is not an exhaustive list of the poetry I've written and submitted over the years. I've submitted dozens more poems to dozens more places, but it gives you an idea that more often than not, your poetry is declined. Some of the time, let's be real, your poetry is not even read, but some of the time, you get success. Soon after I showed Richard my poetry for the first time, I received a phone call from the Dean of Trinity College, the University of Melbourne, informing me that I was the inaugural recipient of the Nakada Brophy Short Fiction and Poetry Award for Young Indigenous Writers. Thank you. This meant so much to me because not only did it show me that hard work, dedication, and perseverance pays off, but that I was finally able to plant those seeds I so desperately wanted to plant with my poetry and my grandfather's legacy. But as an added bonus, I was finally able to tell my friends and family that I wrote poetry. What a feeling. I went to Melbourne to accept my award, and in my acceptance speech, I made an effort to tell people the intention I had for my poetry at the time, which was to completely omit myself from the work I produced. I will read you a direct quote from my acceptance speech. In Land Mountain, I omit the personal I, but use third-person tense. To the extent that it serves as a poetic device, distance facilitates the critical analysis interpretation requires. This sums up the philosophy I had for my poetry at the time, which was to include what I called a degree of distance which would facilitate the critical analysis interpretation requires. It sounds complicated, right? But I assure you, it's not as complicated as it seems. I say that I omit the personal I. Let me give you an example of that. It's the difference between saying I see and simply saying see. I didn't want people to see what I saw. I wanted them to see for themselves. And this, I thought, would facilitate enough critical thought for problems to be seen and solutions to arise. I kept this philosophy for many years, and it served me well. I've been able to travel to different cities and perform to hundreds of people. I've had my work published in literary journals and featured in large-scale art installations and galleries. But because of this, I never thought about writing about myself or my own life, which is why it was a big deal for me to share the poem with you at the start of my talk. I never thought I'd write about something as deeply personal to me as my experience with chronic illness. Let me tell you a bit about my condition. It's called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS. It's a form of dysautonomia, which is essentially the dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, which controls heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, temperature regulation, and the list goes on. The primary feature of POTS is a rapid increase in heart rate upon standing. In my case, my heart rate was increasing up to 100 beats per minute just by the simple act of, well, standing up. Over time, you can imagine it's like running a marathon every single day of your life. It can cause such debilitating fatigue as to restrict you to your bed. POTS is one of the most underdiagnosed and undertreated conditions there are, even though it's associated with a number of other comorbidities and conditions. Most medical doctors don't know much about it, and specialist doctors are few and far between. So often I've been too sick to write, and I could have given up on my poetry at any given time, but I didn't. I realized that by removing myself from the poetry I wrote, I was preventing myself from celebrating the very act of creating despite my health challenges. And I realized that if I wasn't doing myself any favors, I probably wasn't doing anyone else any favors either. I now write and perform poetry proudly, which includes the word I and everything that it encompasses. I want people to know that by sharing your story through what you create, you are allowing it to be heard and instilling the belief in others that their story matters too. The I in poetry matters. After all, how can we plant the seeds of tomorrow if we eliminate ourselves completely from the process? I want you to think of poetry as a metaphor for something you are most passionate and care deeply about. And I want you to recognize your place in what you have achieved, no matter how big or how small that may be. Know that in order for problems to be seen and solutions to arise, your individual human story is often the most powerful and effective tool you have. After all, by distancing yourself from your cause, you allow others to distance themselves too. Now, some of you are probably wondering why I'm giving a TEDx talk about the word I, and some of you are probably thinking, someone dragged this millennial off the stage. But I want you to just give me a little bit longer, and it will make sense. We are living in a world where information is constantly evolving by the second. But how many of us truly believe in the potential that this information has to change the world? And how many of us truly believe in the individuals behind it? Let me give you another example. I can tell you that this or that can change the world, but I ask of you to repeat after me. I change the world.
I change the world.
You can see how much of a difference that makes. I never thought that my chronic illness would have such a profound impact on my poetry, but it did. I still write and perform poetry, which doesn't include the word I, but when I do use it, it is filled with so much belief that it truly matters, not only to me, but to everyone who reads it. It allows us to celebrate the very act of creating, the contribution it makes to the world, but most importantly, our place within it. So I leave you now with some short lines of verse. Be a believer as the bee on the wings of flowers. Be the bearer of beauty of all its powers, but bear the weight of responsibility. If this is the identity we press onto the world, make it stick as sap upon a tree, but make it fair as we are free. Thank you.